You know, if you really want to grasp a culture's deepest ideas, things like justice and community, you sometimes have to start with the most ordinary, everyday details of their lives. So today, we're going to step back into ancient Israel. We're not just looking at how people lived, but how the very layout of their villages, of all things, actually forged their entire civilization. Okay, let's dive right in.
So, a lot of us have probably heard the story of Ruth. She's a widow, she's a foreigner, and she's just trying to survive. But there's this one little detail in her story, right here, that should feel, well, kind of weird to us. She's out gathering leftover grain. That's a practice they called gleaning. And she just happens to end up on land owned by Boaz, who's basically one of the richest guys in town.
I mean, seriously, think about that for a second. Could you just happen to wander onto a huge private farm today? No way. You'd probably be met with fences, gates, a bunch of keep out signs. So the fact that Ruth could do this so casually tells us there's a fundamental piece of her world that we're just not seeing. The clue to solving this whole thing isn't in the words themselves, but in the physical world they're describing. But before we can find that clue, we have to stop and just appreciate the massive distance between our world and theirs. We can't just slap our modern logic onto their ancient reality. We've got to bridge a pretty big cultural gap first. And what's really interesting here is just how stark this contrast is. I mean, look at it. Their world was all about farming, it was local, and it moved at the speed of a harvest. Ours, it's digital, it's global, and it runs 24/7. So to really understand their idea of community, we have to mentally check out of our cities and suburbs and actually step into one of their villages. So here it is, the crucial point. The key that unlocks the story of Ruth, and really their whole social code, is hidden in the physical design of their villages. And what's amazing is that we can actually reconstruct that design, all thanks to a modern community that still follows that ancient blueprint. Okay, so picture this. Back in the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Antoine was studying this village, Kafr al-Ma, and what he found was, well, it was basically a time capsule. Its layout, its farming methods, it was like a living echo of the world described in the Old Testament. It gives us this incredible window into the past.
Okay, let's build this thing out. This is the master plan. Right at the very core, bam, you've got the houses, all packed in together. Then, immediately surrounding the houses, you get a ring of small, private family gardens. And then, wrapping around the gardens, you have the huge, shared grain fields. And on the very outside, the final layer is the woodlands, used for grazing animals and gathering firewood. It's this design of expanding circles, with the community just packed tightly right at the center.
Now, this layout wasn't just about architecture, it was a blueprint for their entire society. That design, especially that massive open ring of farmland, totally dictated how people interacted with each other every single day. And here it is. This is the solution to our mystery. The fields were not carved up into these private, fenced-off properties like we'd imagine today. Nope. It was one gigantic, continuous piece of land. Family plots were just marked off by, like, a line of stones, a boundary that was symbolic, not a physical barrier. And all of a sudden, it just clicks. This is how Ruth happened to be on Boaz's land. She wasn't trespassing on a private farm, she was just gleaning in a huge, collective field. She could literally drift from one family's plot to the next without even realizing she'd crossed a line. The whole system of charity was only possible because of this open layout. The physical space is what made the social ethic work. I mean, just think about what this meant for daily life. Your morning commute was a group walk with your neighbors. Your workplace was basically a massive open-air office that you shared with everyone. You knew exactly who was having a good harvest and who was struggling. And because all the land was inherited, the entire village was basically one big extended family. There was zero anonymity. Your life was an open book. I just love this quote from the source material because it captures the dynamic perfectly. Accountability wasn't some algorithm or a distant authority. It was your cousin, your aunt, your neighbor, the very people you worked alongside and ate lunch with every single day. That social pressure was constant. It was personal, and it was completely unavoidable. So this whole interconnected system, the physical village and the social bonds it created, this wasn't just some accident. It was, in effect, the community's primary social safety net. You could even call it justice by design. So here's the bottom line. For most people, this network of family and shared land was all the support you'd ever need. If you had a bad year, your relatives, your entire village were right there to back you up. But what happened if you were outside that built-in system? And that brings us to the very people that the biblical laws were most concerned with, the social outliers. Widows who no longer had a husband to connect them to that land, orphans who had no parents, and resident aliens, foreigners, just like Ruth, who had no ancestral claim to any land and no family network to rely on. These were the people in real danger of falling right through the cracks.
And this leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? In a society where your entire survival and identity were completely woven into your family and your piece of land, what does true justice actually look like for someone who has lost both? By understanding this village blueprint, we see exactly who was most vulnerable, and we see why the laws of social justice weren't just some lofty ideals. They were a necessary, practical response to the realities of a life without fences.